Hello friends, here we are. This is our last lecture video of the semester and it's a little bittersweet. Now, I know you thought that I was going to be posting 2 more lectures. What I've done here is I've just kind of streamlined them and I've made 1 video, and it's going to actually be 3 parts. First part's going to be about figs, second part is going to be about orchids, and the third part I'm going to talk about a little bit of course rationale. So really today's going to be a lot of stories about pollination, specialization, a little bit of conservation, and let's get started with the figs. That's going to be part 1. And a huge shout out to the fig wasps. As you're about to find out, they play a huge part in the story here. Figs. Maybe you've had them before, bought them from the grocery store, fig Newtons. Have you ever heard the maybe myth, maybe not, we're about to find out, that there's like wasps in your fig Newtons? Those are the crunchy things. Well, we're about to find out a little bit more about that. Here is a picture of what figs kind of look like when they're growing on the tree. Now, here in Arcata, we happen to have a bunch that were planted a long time ago here, and I happen to have a few in my yard, and they've just produced these fabulous giant figs. Anyway, figs are in the genus Ficus, and there are 800 species. They're native to the tropics. So the one that I have in my yard here, not native. Just a great culinary perk. Now these are in the family Moraceae. You don't need to know any family characteristics here or anything. About angiosperms in general. The ancestor of all angiosperms had animal pollination, right? And we know of a few taxa who evolved wind pollination from that animal pollinated angiosperm ancestor. Things like grasses and alders and oaks and plantago. Very few things, though, evolved from a wind-pollinated angiosperm ancestor back to an angio-pollinated plant, and figs are one example of that, actually. Here is a close relative of the figs. This is not a fig, this is a morus, this is mulberry, and notice that we've got unisexual flowers here, both of them on their own respective catkins. You can see, like, you know what a catkin is. You've got this inflorescence axis, like an inflorescence axis like this, let's say. I actually can't see myself in this video, so hopefully my arm is in it. We've got flowers kind of on the outside in a catkin or a spike or something like that. Okay, that's what's going on here. You know that. What happened in the figs, again, these are close relatives to those things with catkins. Those flowers that are on the outside over evolutionary time, they switched to being on the inside, meaning the entire inflorescence flipped inside out, like this. So where the flowers were once on the outside, they are now on the inside of this inflorescence. So if that arm motion didn't make any sense, I apologize. What's going on here is that these things in the middle, those are the flowers. All of this on the outside, this is the inside out inflorescence axis. And by inside out, I don't mean like this thing starts out one way and flips inside out. No, I'm talking about over evolutionary time, over eons, this changed to having its flowers on the inside from a relative, an ancestor that was closely, maybe similar, sort of, to that mulberry from the last slide. Okay, so the outside here of this whole structure is what becomes fleshy and swollen and attractive to a seed disperser. In other words, a fig is technically a ecoberry. And what this structure is called, this is unique to the figs, it's called a syconium. This is a hollow inflorescence with many small flowers attached on the inside, kind of like I just described. Cool. Here are some examples of some real-life figs. Now, like I said earlier, there are about 800 species. Just huge diversity of size, shape, color, and a really huge diversity in pollinators, except all of the pollinators for all of those different species of figs are fig wasps. It's just that there's a lot of species of fig wasps. So that's what we're going to get to talking about. Here is a diagram of one of those syconiums. This is a longitudinal section of one of those. And here's sort of the photo of what this actually looks like. So again, in this diagram, we it's highly diagrammatic. We really reduced it to just a few pictures of flowers. But in reality, there are bajillions, thousands of tiny, tiny little flowers. And yeah, sometimes there is this really drastic cut between the male flowers, as you can see up here on top, and the female flowers, as you can see right here, kind of on the bottom. Okay. So that's real life, but we're going to use the diagram form for this little explanation. Now, within these female flowers, within these flowers down here, we have two types of flowers. They're both female, but we have two types. One of them has a really long style and a short pedicel down here. The other one has a shorter style and a longer pedicel down here. Right? You see the kind of relationship there? They're both the same height in total, but one has a much longer style and therefore shorter pedestal. So what's up with that? Well, it has to do with pollination. These have a very, very specific pollination. With your flowers on the inside of your inflorescence, you gotta have something very, very specialized to get inside. Because the only way to get inside is right here in this opening. This is called an ostiole, and it's covered, it's guarded by many tightly overlapping bracts, as you can kind of see in this diagram here. So here we have a female. She's a pregnant female. She's bearing eggs, and she senses a fig. So she approaches this opening. She kind of knows what to do. She totally, 100% knows what to do innately. She goes into this opening. And this is a pretty drastic thing to do with all those overlapping bracts. It's a very tight squeeze, but she knows what she's got to do. She's got to lay her eggs, and there's only one place on Earth that she can lay her eggs, and that is inside of a fig flower ovary. What? Yeah, these things right here. These things. It's the only place that she can lay her eggs. So she goes into that hole. And this is what she looks like after she makes her way through this opening on her way to oviposit. She loses her antennae and her wings. She gets totally beat up. A lot of time her abdomen and guts get all beat up because that opening is so aggressive to get inside of. It's so hard to get inside of. But this is all that she needs to do to complete her life. She oviposits her eggs and then she dies. She oviposits her eggs into very specific flowers, though. We have two types of flowers, remember. And she only oviposits her eggs into these ones right here, the ones with the short styles. The only reason is because that's the only one that she can reach her ovipositor into. This is her ovipositor right here, and this is what an egg travels through, and then an egg is laid right there inside of the fig flower ovary. That's what these lumps are. These are fig flower ovaries, these things, right? So she can't lay her eggs inside of these fig flower ovaries because the styles are too long. And so those ones with the long styles, they become fig babies. Or in other words, seeds. The short-styled flowers, though, they become wasp babies. What? Okay, so mom dies, moving on. This is actually where it starts to get really interesting. After some time, those eggs, they're developing. They go through different developmental stages. And what happens first is the males emerge. These ones right here, they emerge and they look just like that. Notice they're kind of strange-looking insects. They don't have wings. They don't have antennae. Their eyes are basically non-functional. They've got these buff arms, though. See that? Also not shown is a very large male mating organ. In fact, one of the largest relative to body size in the animal kingdom. Turns out they have very few functions, and what they do is they emerge before their sisters. And they promptly go find the eggs that have their sisters in them. They break into them and they mate with their sisters. Unfortunately, especially from a human's perspective, that just sounds really horrible. But that's just what happens with the figs. This is just the way their life cycle works. And then they immediately go and find a spot and start digging a tunnel, an escape tunnel, through this inflorescence wall. And then once they reach the outside here, they see light for the first time. And you might be thinking, oh, that's when they're probably happy and they see light and they go fly away. No, that's actually when they just die. They promptly die. Their function of life is fulfilled at this point. So sometime later, their sisters emerge. They are egg-bearing when they emerge, right? Because they have already kind of been mated with. And so by the time they emerge, egg-bearing, the male flowers of this Syconium right here are mature. And just innately, she knows what to do. She goes up to those male flowers and she does this cool pollen dance. She gets pollen all over herself. And then she finds her way to the escape tunnel that her late ancestral brother dug for her. And then she flies away and she starts the life cycle all over again. So that's how figs get pollinated. How about that? This is what fig wasps actually look like. They are very tiny. You would not be able to distinguish between most of these 800 or so fig wasp species as a novice because they're so small and so very similar looking. But if you're interested in this, there's a whole website called FigWeb on this. Now, the fig trees themselves and the fig wasps, they have what's called an obligate mutualism, meaning they are completely dependent on one another for at least one part of their life cycle, right? The fig wasps cannot complete their life cycle without those fig ovaries. And the fig trees themselves, they can't get pollinated without those female wasps emerging from one fig and then flying to another. And then what happens with those figs after all of that story that I just said is the fruits kind of develop, and then that whole Syconium gets eaten by something like a bat, or tons of other things eat these, and then hopefully from the fig's perspective they get pooped out far away, and those seeds can germinate and form another giant tree. Because, by the way, sometimes these figs are huge trees. There's a huge diversity in their habit, though. They could be canopy level trees, we'll talk about that picture in a sec. They can be shrubs, vines, stranglers. What's going on here in this picture on the left here is actually, this is the fig. This tree right here, this other color, this is sort of the original tree. It used to be all of that. And then the fig came along and it shot up some stem, and then it started kind of strangling out that original plant, using it as scaffolding, more or less, like you can see in this picture that I just put up on the right. And here it sort of suffocates the original one, sometimes killing it, and then becoming sort of its own standalone tree. And sometimes they can form these giant buttresses. Maybe you've seen these if you've ever been to the tropics. Really impressive trees. Usually really dominant giant forest trees in the rainforest. Now, a whole slew of organisms use fig trees in the tropics for things like eating and laying eggs, making nests, raising young. And because of this, figs are generally considered keystone species, even though there are hundreds of species of them. They usually are essentially acting as an entire ecosystem, a single tree sometimes. A wide net of creatures depend on it. They play crucial roles in various food webs, and that's why they're considered keystone species. If you're interested, I highly recommend, after you're done studying with everything, finals, it's summertime, please look up this documentary. It's called, you can just Google The Queen of Trees. It's I think my personal favorite nature documentary. Cool. Part 2, orchids. All right, let's talk about orchids. Here's a picture of a native one. This is called the Calypso bulbosa. They're flowering right now inland. And let's start by talking about the fact that they are extremely diverse. There are 20,000 or more species. This is tied with Asteraceae as the largest family. And they're monocots. They are most diverse in the tropics, but really found all over the place, even up, notice like up in Alaska and Canada even, but some hotspots of diversity, places like Costa Rica and Venezuela, Ecuador, have a copious amount of orchid species. As Robin Bensie would say, they are intoxicatingly beautiful and diverse flowers, possibly the most specialized group. Let's talk about that. Tons of new species that are just being found year after year. Not this one, actually. Here's just another picture of a local one. The reason why so many are being found every year is sort of because of their habit. They tend to grow on trees. Not always, but they tend to be epiphytic, especially in the rainforest, and they can just grow vertically, essentially. Their habitat is expanded vertically. So you'll see even really tiny orchids way up in the tops of trees. A single tree could have dozens of species on it. including other species, non-orchids like bromeliads and whatnot. So here's what their fruits are like. They have capsules with these tiny seeds, sometimes up to 20,000 seeds. They're very tiny, and they are dependent on fungus actually to germinate. And so here's a germinating seedling, and what they've done here is they've taken a cross section, and under the microscope you can tell that embedded within cells, so here's the delineation of one orchid cell, there's all of these little stringy things. These are mycelium of fungal cells, of fungus, yeah. They are completely dependent on that, and that's why if you're trying to grow an orchid from seed, you have to do it in the lab. You have to be using plant tissue culture. You've got to be wearing a lab jacket, a lab coat, petri dishes, all the goods. And there are some things that you still cannot grow even in the lab. People cannot get things like these to grow. These are parasitic orchids. Now, parasitic plants are not restricted to the orchid family, but here are some really special, actually local parasitic orchids. We have a good handful of parasitic local orchids. I highly recommend you check them out. Now let's talk about some floral formula stuff. We've already talked about how Liliaceae sensulato, in the broad sense, had a 3-3-6-3 floral formula. Well, Orchidaceae is very, very similar to that, except we've got zygomorphic flowers, and that's why we can, we'll talk about the corolla in a sec. We have way less stamens, and we have an inferior ovary. Those are sort of the major differences there. And that's for Orchidaceae. Now, we actually have an adnation of the andrecium and the gynoecium. This is something we've never seen before in plant tax. It's really fancy. We're not going to get into the great details. Just know this term column. It's the adnation between the andrecium and the gynoecium, like I just said. The andrecium is modified to be a pollinium. We're going to talk about that. And that one in the corolla, notice we've got a 2+1 situation here. The one oddball is called a lip. So what do I mean by that? The lip is this usually very pronounced part of the perianth. You can really obviously see it in this one from that very first slide that I showed you. That's the lip down there. Now the column, this is that adnation of the gynoecium and the andrecium that's up there. And up here, it's sort of hiding under that upper perianth part. Now, all orchid flowers, when they're developing in bud, they do a 180-degree twist. So the lip, believe it or not, this lip is actually the upper petal. What? Makes no sense. It's the upper petal developmentally, but it turns around and becomes functionally the lower petal. And now, here's just a few species within this one genus, Angricum. This species down here, notice its lip is actually on the top. It's this giant thing. These other species in the genus have their lip on the bottom, like most orchids. But this species down here has its lip on the top. What it does is actually, instead of doing the 180-degree twist during the developmental bud early stage, it does a 360-degree twist. So instead of sort of, since its lip apparently needs to be on top to attract its very specific pollinator, so over time, evolutionarily, they've kind of adapted this upper position for their lip. So instead of evolutionarily just not twisting 180 degrees developmentally, they do an extra 180-degree twist for no apparent reason. And this is sort of why you see some academic arguments in the literature against intelligent design and creationism using this Angricum species that's super resupinate as an example of that. Pretty cool. Here's a close-up look at the column. What they have is this little anther cap. If we move the anther cap, we see this pollinium. That is this structure right here. This is the andrecium, which is why I just circled it in blue. Sorry for the heteronormativity there. And what we see next is if we were to kind of remove the stamen, or essentially the stamens, which is just this whole structure right here, we see that this group of plants, orchids, they don't just release pollen grains. Instead, they put all of their pollen grains into this one sac, or really kind of two sacs. And here is one pollinium, and here's the other pollinium. The plural is pollinia. And this whole structure here, including the stipe and the viscidium, is the pollinarium. That's the difference between those two words. You don't need to know stipe and viscidium. You do need to know pollinia, though. These are the pollen sacs right there. The viscidium, this is a sticky part. And the reason why they have all of their pollen in one sac is because orchids use precision pollination. That viscidium sticks to the back or the face or the leg of some very specific pollinator. And we're talking very specialized. Sometimes it's just like one very specific species of bee or something like that. Here are some other examples. Sometimes they are hanging off of the bee or the wasp or the fly in a funny way. Sometimes they're on their legs. Now this picture is really cool. It's showing a diagram of all of the different positions of pollinarium attachment for this one species of euglossine bee. We've got a pollinarium, look at that one right there, hanging off on the side like an earring. That's a pollinarium from a species of orchid. And then, according to this diagram, this is a different pollinarium of a different species of orchid. And H is a different species of orchid. I, yet a different species of orchid. You get it? These are all different species of orchids pollinarium attachment on this one species. So they can kind of partition the body of this one pollinator, who's apparently a very good pollinator. Here are just some other pictures of orchids to get you stoked about the family. Please feel free to pause the screen and look at these, stare at them for as long as you need to. Remember, those terms column and lip apply to all of these pictures. This one here on the right is a picture taken from your very own greenhouse at HSU. Here's some more pictures. Look at the just incredible diversity. This one happens to resemble a bird from our human perspective. I don't believe that has to do with their pollination. Look at these. Just drastic differences between them. I mean, what? Are you kidding me? Look at the habit of this thing. That's wild. And look at how tiny this one is. This one, by the way, that's not a pollinator. That's actually the corolla of this orchid. It happens to look like an insect. More on that actually a little bit later. I have no words for these ones. Just wow. The smallest orchid happened to have been recently discovered in Ecuador. Who's to say that there are not smaller species out there that haven't been discovered? This seems like a most effective time to drop a kind of depressing and powerful statement, but unfortunately all of these orchids are at great risk right now due to deforestation in the rainforest, especially due to palm oil farming and cattle grazelands. We really need to stop deforestation. It is a massive problem. I wish I could spend more time talking about this. It really is a big problem. If you care about orchids, you should care about this. Moving on. Orchids are so special. One of the reasons why they're so special is because, again, they use this deception. They use this they use precision pollination, excuse me. One of the precision pollination techniques they use is deception pollination. This one. Notice, this orchid has a lip that's on the top here. Horrible color. The lip is on the top, and then the column is down here on the bottom. So it's non-resupinate. It's not super resupinate. It's non-resupinate. And what happens is it happens to live in a place that where this flower grows. Now, this flower provides lots of nectar rewards to its pollinators. The orchid, on the other hand, does not provide nectar to its pollinators. Instead, it mimics the colors of this nectar-providing species that lives nearby. So when a pollinator comes by and is interested in this flower, thinks it might have nectar, it lands right here, like this one in this diagram is about to do. It lands right there and it doesn't get any nectar. And to add injury to insult, the darn flower snaps closed on the pollinator and it gets stuck there. It gets stuck for just a few seconds or so, but just long enough for the pollinarium, the sticky part of the pollinarium, to stick to that pollinator. And then the pollinator can kind of wiggle its way out after a long enough time, and then it's got a pollinarium attached to it now. So this is a really fancy technique for the orchid to get its gametes out there. Now, another way, I wonder if you've heard about this, another way that orchids use deception pollination is with sex and lies. This is not a pollinator, this is just a flower. This is also just a flower, and same with these. These are all pictures of species within the genus Ophrys. I think that's how it's pronounced, but I'm not really sure. Now, these are not pollinators. Again, there are no insects in any of these pictures. These flowers are mimicking insects. These species of orchids, they're all very closely related, yet they do not hybridize, it turns out. They live in the same place. They bloom at the same time. They're even interfertile. But they use different pollinators. It's as simple as that. They're attracting different pollinators. And so they really do not hybridize, even though they're closely related. Here are some other looks. These are, yet again, other species in the same genus. Just huge variation, all of them mimicking some different species. And they're mimicking something very specific. They're mimicking fertile females of these pollinator species. Not only do they look like these females, they're also emitting an aroma of the pheromones that are released only when fertile females are nearby. So they're completely irresistible to sexually active males of the pollinator species. And what happens is the males attempt to copulate, and in doing so, they get a pollinarium attached to their head or their back or somewhere. You can't blame them. Those are quite attractive flowers, especially from that male wasp's perspective, who's got those olfactory sense capabilities. Wow. Amazing flowers. Part 3, Course Rationale. You have learned so much this semester. I haven't counted how many taxa. Maybe you have, but it's been a lot of taxa. I just want you to think of which one was your favorite, or which one you really, really liked, or maybe there's some other plant that you like out there, and just kind of think about it. This is one of my favorites. It's Iris bracteata, and I wanted to talk about a little bit of research on it. And I want you to think about your favorite plant and think about the fact that you should do more research on it. After this class is done and you have more time, spend some time getting to know more plants now that you kind of know how to. So here's a little bit more about mine. It's Iris bracteata. It's a native to California. And just to remind you about the iris, the sepals, the petals. Remember that petaloid style. That's kind of up on top here. There are 3 of them. And, all right. So here's a little bit more about the iris that I haven't really talked to you about. Here's what they look like during the male phase, because the stigma is actually right here. So what happens is during the receptive female stage, the flap of that stigma is kind of down and exposed, because it's only the upper surface of this that is actually receptive. So when a pollinator enters during the male phase, that stigma is in the sort of up position like that. So it enters to go get the nectar. It comes out with pollen grains, and then it goes to another flower. And let's say this is a different pollinator who's already done that, who's been to a different flower. Now it approaches this flower during the female phase, or the stigma receptive phase, and it's got pollen from a different flower in theory. It deposits that pollen, it goes in for the nectar, because it doesn't know that it's depositing pollen. On its way out, it kind of backs out and gets pollen from this flower now, but it doesn't end up self-pollinating because the backside of the stigma is not receptive and it kind of closes behind it. It's highly effective at preventing self-pollination. Well, it turns out the organisms who are doing these are these flies. Check out that mouthpiece on that fly. That's pretty impressive. These are called Euloncus. And check those out. Here's what they do. It turns out that the life cycles of both the iris and the Euloncus are intimately tied, especially the reproductive cycles, where this is where they find mates. And it turns out that double-decker style of Euloncus fly here is really effective at pollinating, because they can get really close to that stigma. It seems to be more effective at getting pollen on the stigma even. So really, there's an intimate relationship between the reproductive cycles of both parties here. Well, there's another part of the party here, and it has to do with this. You might know this about me. I have fear of spiders. Not a big fan of spiders. Now, I love nature. I go camping all the time. Anyway, I know spiders exist. I have a little bit of respect for them, and when I found out about this story, I had much more respect for them. This is called a turret spider. These are an important part of the life cycle here. Like I said, they need duff. Notice that this picture is surrounded by needles. They really need to be living in intact forests that have good duff, good dead needles, because this is how they live. They bury themselves sort of in these holes. They make these holes, and then they wait for things to kind of cross over that hole entrance. It's super creepy if you're creeped out by that. Anyway, here's another picture of it. They can be kind of camouflaged, but they really only do this where they're able to be well camouflaged, right? This is the only place that they're able to live. Here's a closer up look at it again. So how is this related? Okay. The Euloncus female, after the mating, the female, it has eggs, and the way that she lays her eggs is she sort of drops them on the forest floor, sort of bombardier style, if you will. And the eggs, they hatch right there. These little larvae, maggot things are kind of crawling around, and they're looking for these holes. They're looking for these very specific holes. These little tiny maggots, I'm assuming they're very, very tiny like that. They crawl into these holes. The spider doesn't even notice it. They somehow make themselves into the body of the spider. And there they enter a state of diapause until the spider is large enough to provide enough nutritional content for that maggot larva fly to become an adult. And when it does so, when the spider does become large enough, that larva will start eating the spider from the inside out. And once it has done so, a adult Euloncus will emerge from the spider. One spider rears one fly. And so that's the relationship there. The Euloncus needs the spider. The iris needs the Euloncus. This spider needs intact forests. And so there's a very tight network here, an intimate relationship between all of these organisms, and it starts with intact forests. And it turns out that there are tons of other things that are pollinated by these Euloncus flies, and they are spectacular things. Notice some of the ones in this picture, like, wow, these are just in northwestern California. That Clarkia contina is one of my personal favorite flowers of all time. So all of these flowers need Euloncus, which need that spider, which need intact forests. And so this is all related to conservation here. And this is just one species, Iris bracteata, that I told you this story about, right? Each one of you just kind of were thinking about a favorite taxon that I asked you to think about earlier. And all of those favorite taxa that you just picked have their own story like this that's intimately tied to other taxa, to other plants, other animals, and really they're all part of some unique ecological network. And this is just one species is my point, okay? And so say this is my favorite species, Iris bracteata. This is one part of the story. You need to know the ecology. You need to know the morphology. You need to know what's up with this plant alive. That's one part of knowing a plant. The other part of knowing a plant is its history, is its evolutionary history. Where did it get the traits that it's got? Who is it closely related to? Remember the great dualism, different creatures, common features. We've got all of these things, all of these irises, right? And they're in this larger family called the Iridaceae. Well, all of the irises, all of the Iridaceae are in a larger group called the monocots. And there's a whole history. And so back to that favorite taxon of yours. One part of knowing a plant is knowing its morphology, its ecology, its present day stuff. The other part is knowing its evolutionary history, in my opinion. So say you like irises. Look at all of these different irises that exist out there. These are all very close relatives. Very, very close relatives. They're all in the same genus Iris. And the diversity that we met this semester, it was just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more out there, and now you know how to learn about plants, and I hope you take it further. And when you ask your question about your favorite taxon, where did your plant get its traits from? Where did Iris bracteata get its petaloid styles from? Where did it get those equitant leaves from? What about the fact that it just has one cotyledon or double fertilization? What about just the simple fact that Iris has seeds and chloroplasts? Where did it get all these traits from? Well, the answer is that it got it from different common ancestors. These were important historical organisms in the life of Iris bracteata. So all of the irises, they all have petaloid styles, and all of the monocots have one cotyledon, and so on and so forth here. And all of the things that we learned this semester have chloroplasts, from the ferns and the conifers to the angiosperms. They all inherited those chloroplasts from one common ancestor, some autotrophic eukaryote who first inherited chloroplasts. And that's a really special thing. You've got to know about your favorite plants. You've got to know kind of where they fit in with the circle of life and in the tree of life. That's kind of what it's all about here. And this is how you're connected to all of these things. So you also have a lot in common with that favorite plant taxon from the semester. Just like you have a lot in common with grizzly bears and bees and ferns. Cool. So more on course rationale. It's really sad that we didn't get to spend more time together and spend more time together outside, but I hope you do. We are so lucky to have taken plant taxonomy here in California with our 5,000 native species, 1,300 of which are endemic to California, not found anywhere else. So I really hope that when you're allowed to, where you're allowed to, you go outside and you try to find these things and you keep learning. And congratulations, you are cured of the green blur. I wanted to let you know that. I wanted to share this quote with you too. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand. And we will understand only what we are taught. This is a quote from Baba Dayom, a Senegalese conservationist. This is one of my favorite quotes, and it just kind of seems like a good way to end the semester. For those of you who are graduating, congratulations. I don't know if you know this or not, but you're making a pledge. You pledge to thoroughly investigate and take into account the social and environmental consequences of any job opportunity that you consider. I personally would like to add to that a little bit. I hope that you also pledge to teach your friends and family, especially children, about plants and animals. This is so important that we keep children and we keep each other excited about nature and plants and animals. Otherwise, they will not be understood and therefore they will not get conserved. Anyway, I would like to give a huge thanks to a bunch of people. Ethan, our plant collector, if you ever see him, he did a fabulous job, even though it was cut short. Thank you so much, Ethan. Kenan, he was a noob, a first-time TA, and he absolutely killed it. Sarah, as always, was lovely this semester and has just nailed down the excellence of teaching plant taxonomy. And also a massive thank you to Michael Messler for your wisdom and inspiration all the time. I will see you all soon, hopefully at Bittersweet or something. I will keep you posted on that. Have an awesome summer, and email me if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.